I'll start those. I'll start those here in just a second. Very glad to join you. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, so this is a coast-to-coast experience today. With the impact being, of course, that I am just getting going this morning. So I've got my cup of coffee with me that I will sip from time to time. Joel, just let me know that you can see the slides okay there.
We got them, Jim. You're ready to go.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to make a bit of a kind of a macroeconomic perspective, I guess, on the issue of the budget challenges facing Newfoundland. How do we understand them? What are the underlying drivers? What are the ways to go forward addressing them? And what are the ways to not go forward addressing them? This is the website for our Centre for Future Work. I am the economist and director at the Centre for Future Work. We have an office here in Vancouver, and we have one in Sydney, Australia. And I invite folks to see our research there, all open access. You're welcome to join the conversation on social media as well. You're welcome to post from this presentation if you'd like. There's my Twitter handle and the Centre's Twitter handle. Noticing this morning the CPI numbers are out and inflation is up to 4% on a year-over-year basis. Now, anyone who follows it knows that's not going to stay, but where we're concerned with government debt, a little inflation is a good thing. So just calculate what 4% inflation would knock off of our Newfoundland's accumulated debt. The presentation that I'll go through, what is the actual budget constraint facing government and challenging some of the sort of common assumptions in that regard. Secondly, unpacking and understanding the different factors that are driving the accumulation of debt, budget balances, and interest rates. Third, in light of that, taking a look at some of the history around Newfoundland's fiscal evolution. And then number four, addressing what I would say is the real problem behind the recent deficit challenges, particularly what's been happening on the macroeconomic side, and a few lessons from Europe. So that will be the overview of my presentation. There's an assumption still, it's not shared by many economists anymore, assumption still that governments have to balance their budgets. And we still get politicians, we've seen a few of them in this federal election, standing up saying the government has to act like a household, a responsible household, and balance its budget. Now, of course, they say that with one hand, but these politicians make as many expensive promises on the other hand as their competitors do. So I'm not sure how seriously they believe this pledge that they have to balance the budget. And the analogy to households doesn't work at all. Households do not balance their budgets, and it's a good thing they don't either, because we'd be in a depression if we didn't have households that borrowed in order to fund major purchases, including homes, cars, and university educations. And household debt in aggregate has grown monotonically and increasingly in recent years. And, we obviously watch household debt as we do corporate debt, but nobody ever says the household sector, the corporate sector has to balance its budget, let alone eliminate its debt. So that analogy is just hokey and just wrong. Like other actors, the public sector can and should accumulate debt on an ongoing basis. This is normal and, in fact, positive, particularly when debt is associated with investment in long-lived productive assets. Same reason you use a mortgage to buy a house, instead of assuming that somebody has to save up all the money before they can live in that house. At the national level, there's an added dimension, which is countries like Canada have their own currency, their own banking system. And in that regard, there is ultimately no monetary constraint on what government can and can't do. The only constraint is the real resources that are available to put to work doing things, including providing public services. For a subnational government, of course, it's a different story. So provincial governments in Canada have a more binding fiscal constraint than a national government does, and that's why we count on the national government to do the fiscal heavy lifting at times when we need it, such as during the COVID pandemic. But even for a subnational government, the idea that you have to balance a budget is absolutely, it's just a kind of an old-fashioned ideological notion. It isn't actually a real binding constraint at all. What we would look for at a subnational level is some level of stability in the long run in the debt burden relative to GDP, or even more precisely, some stability in the cost of servicing that debt burden relative to GDP. That second criteria is an easier or more relaxed criteria when the interest rate is declining over years, as it has been. It's a more strict criteria if interest rates were rising. Newfoundland's interest rate, like other government borrowers, has been falling, and it will continue to fall. Even if short-term interest rates go back up, Newfoundland is still turning over large amounts of high interest rate debt that it issued decades ago. So in any foreseeable situation, Newfoundland's average interest rate on its debt is going to continue to decline. And that makes it, again, an even easier constraint. So just for historical perspective, this is Newfoundland's debt service burden as a share of GDP, and it declined dramatically through the late 90s and the 2000s, and has stabilized since then at somewhere between 2 and 3% of GDP. And this is the little bump that we saw last year with the COVID pandemic, the dramatic impact on Newfoundland's economy, like other parts of Canada, the increase in the deficit and the resulting increase in interest costs. So hard to believe that this is a crisis. And we have seen the politics play out in other jurisdictions, just as it's played out in Newfoundland over the last year or two, a form of shock doctrine, if you like, where the apparent risk and threat and doomsday scenarios associated with debt are invoked in order to try and justify painful measures that the population wouldn't accept otherwise. I'm pleased to see most Newfoundlanders won't accept it anyways. The threat of major austerity and cutbacks in public services and other dramatic changes to address the debt crisis, because it isn't a debt crisis, and that's clear from the historical perspective. Now, how do all of these factors fit together? Well, I'm going to go through a few equations, so I'm sorry if this is going to give anyone a headache, or if you already had a headache this morning. A few equations to zero in on what are the factors driving the growth in debt as a share of GDP. Let's assume in this that the interest rate is stable. But as I mentioned, the interest rate for Newfoundland, the average effective interest rate, will continue to decline over time. And that means that the constraint that I outline here will be even more relaxed in real life. Let's assume the interest rate is stable, and then the constraint becomes some kind of stability in the debt to GDP ratio. The change in that debt to GDP ratio can be decomposed as the rate of change in the debt, the numerator, minus the rate of change in GDP, the denominator, which can also be phrased as the ratio of the deficit to the outstanding debt. So how fast in proportionate terms is the accumulated stock of debt growing, less the rate of growth of GDP. Now, the deficit itself has two components. The first component there in this equation is the interest burden on the debt. So that will equal the current interest rate times the accumulated stock of debt. The second component of the deficit is what we'd call the operating deficit. So all current revenues minus program costs. That's all expenses other than interest expenses, which are captured in the first term. Both of those, again, expressed as a rate of proportionate growth of the debt burden itself. So then we can pull out the interest rate and the GDP growth rate and separately identify the operating deficit as a proportion of the outstanding debt stock. And this is where we get the famous debt stability equation, that the change in the debt burden as a share of GDP will depend on the difference between the rate of interest paid on the debt and the growth of nominal GDP, with an incremental addition if there's an operating deficit added as a proportion of the debt burden. So what are the implications of all that math? If the rate of growth of nominal GDP is greater than the nominal interest rate, then without doing anything, the debt to GDP burden, which is the ultimate constraint when interest rates are stable, that burden will tend to decline over time. Another way of thinking of it is that burden can be stable. If that is our constraint, we can meet that constraint and in fact have an ongoing operating deficit, let alone an ongoing deficit, an ongoing operating deficit. So we can pay our debt service charges and still maintain a modest operating deficit and still have stability in the debt to GDP ratio. the bigger is the difference between the nominal GDP growth and the interest rate, the bigger would be that operating deficit that can be sustained without increasing the debt to GDP ratio. And in fact, the story is even better than that. First of all, there's the possibility that interest rates will fall over time, and that will be the case for Newfoundland. That gives you even more room. Secondly, the operating deficit itself does also depend on the rate of growth of nominal GDP. As we know, deficits tend to be cyclical, and when GDP growth slows, because of the automatic stabilizers on both the revenue and the expense side, the operating deficit will grow. So when GDP growth is strong, you would normally expect a smaller operating deficit, other parameters being the same. So if we want, we can try to incorporate that second order relationship between the operating deficit and GDP growth. Think that the operating deficit could be described as some kind of autonomously determined level of government spending. So governments decide on their program spending. We won't capture any automatic stabilizers on the expense side, but we will try to capture the automatic stabilizers on the taxation side. That spending is compared to the level of tax revenue coming in, which can be described as some kind of aggregate tax rate times the level of nominal GDP. So a change in that operating deficit will depend on the change in the program spending side, less any changes in tax revenue arising from the aggregate tax rate applied to GDP. So here we can isolate the term for nominal GDP growth as well, and plug that back into the overall equation for the operating deficit, and then for the change in the debt to GDP ratio. And if I've done the math right, here's my cup of coffee just to double check that, then you see that the constraint, the parameter in brackets at the beginning of that equation, is no longer the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate. It's now the difference between the interest rate and a growth rate supplemented by a term which captures the impact of stronger growth on tax revenues. So that gives you even a little bit more room to maintain ongoing operating deficits consistent with stable debt to GDP ratio. Now, what does all that math mean in Newfoundland's case? Well, we are starting this year with a debt to GDP ratio, looking at the provincial debt, of about 47%. So that's a significant debt ratio, no doubt about it. How do we keep it stable? Well, let's look at the other factors. The average rate of nominal GDP growth in Newfoundland over the last 30 years has been 4.5%. Now, some years it's better, some years it's worse. Remember, this isn't a sunny period. There's a codfish crisis in there. There's obviously the current COVID crisis. There was the post-2014 meltdown in oil prices. So Newfoundland's been through a lot in those 30 years and still managed a 4.5% long-run nominal growth rate. And I don't see any particular reason why that shouldn't be an expectation moving forward. A combination of something like 2.5% real growth with 2% inflation, which is the Bank of Canada's target, of course. The average effective interest rate on provincial debt paid in the current year's budget, according to the budget, is 3.7%. Now that overstates the interest rates moving forward, because all of the bonds that the government is issuing now over the last 2 years are significantly less expensive than that. And the short run bonds are very inexpensive, shorter or medium run bonds on interest rate terms. You even have, that should be a 30-year bond that was issued, not a 50-year bond. It goes out to 2050 at a 3.32% interest rate. So over the last 2 years, that's the range of interest rates reported by the government on new bond issues. So over time, as the stock of debt is recycled and renewed at newer, lower interest rates, the average interest rate is going to decline further. And then the gap between interest rate and nominal growth rate will get wider. That would imply room in Newfoundland at current levels of debt for an annual operating deficit of around $400 million a year. And on top of that, of course, you have the debt service charges itself. So a total deficit of $1 billion a year, which is not much different than the one in the current budget, is absolutely sustainable given those fiscal and economic parameters. And the doomsday prophesizing that Newfoundland must balance its budget or the world as we know it will come to an end, which have been invoked over the last 2 years to try and justify the fiscal restraint and austerity that was threatened and to a modest extent implemented, although the budget was not nearly as bad as the threats. That doomsday prophesizing is quite inappropriate. Let's look at the historical evolution of some of those factors that contribute to Newfoundland's situation. This is the evolution of revenues. I know we've had some discussions about whether Newfoundland has a revenue problem or an expense problem. To some extent, I would argue neither. Based on this evidence, revenues on a total basis have declined. That largely reflects relative diminution of federal transfer payments. Own source revenues have been broadly stable, somewhere around under 20% of GDP, but even on an own source basis, there's clearly room to increase that if we decided that it was needed. Hard to say that we have a spending problem either. We saw a long run decline in program spending as a share of GDP quite significantly over the 90s and 2000s, a bump up during the global financial crisis and the subsequent flattening out of program spending at something over 20% of GDP. The budget balances that are implied by this comparison are all over the place. There's been years, of course, when Newfoundland's had big deficits, including last year. There's been years that it's had surpluses. The previous discussion focused on the operating deficit as a parameter for debt stability, and that's the red line underneath. Interesting to see in most years, Newfoundland's had an operating surplus. So this measures a deficit. So a deficit is positive. That means a surplus is negative. And the dashed line shows the average operating surplus over this period, over the last 30 years, was over 3% of GDP. So never mind being able to sustain an operating deficit, which is possible given the debt stability conditions that we just went through. Newfoundland's actually had an operating surplus. And even in the current year's budget, it has an operating surplus. A small one, but it's still at an operating surplus. So by the debt stability conditions outlined above, Newfoundland has ability to run a bigger deficit, not a need to get rid of it. Net debt, of course, declined with the initial years of the oil expansion. It has increased since 2014 and the downturn in the oil industry and the deficits that went along with it. But debt service charges, as I pointed out, have not increased, not even significantly last year, because the decline in interest rates offset the increase in the debt burden. And this is the ultimate constraint. And again, there's lots of reason to believe that this is not about to go shooting up. Now, a couple of the issues related to that debt stability analysis: what happens if the nominal GDP growth tanks? And of course, recessions do happen, and we just experienced a big one, a historic one. Now, for various reasons, you also want to leave room for the government to have counter-cyclical adjustments and responses to a recession, so you don't want them to be constrained on the fiscal side. So that doesn't mean you have to balance the budget even in good years. What it does mean is that you can cycle fiscal policy around some kind of trend trajectory that is consistent with debt stability in the long run. So this is a hypothetical and numerical example, but the numbers are appropriate for Newfoundland's case. In a normal year, you would have something like 4.5% nominal GDP growth, and you can have a small total deficit. In a recession year, you have zero nominal growth and a big deficit. Then you have a couple of years of recovery and transition. It doesn't have to be this precise timetable, but something like a recession with a big deficit every decade, with interspersed with years of recovery and smaller deficits, not balanced budgets, smaller deficits, is quite consistent with stability in the long run, with debt cycling along with the macroeconomic adjustments. The second big question that comes up all the time, of course, is what happens to interest rates. Now, interest rates are not exogenous. Interest rates are a policy variable, but they're not set in Newfoundland, of course. monetary policy makers generally don't try to shoot the country in the foot, although from time to time that has happened. They are going to look at the impacts of interest rate adjustments, and even their current monetary policy rule, which is to target 2% inflation, is not set in stone. There's debates on right now about adjusting the Bank of Canada's rule, perhaps to include a dual mandate of some kind in reference to employment growth. History shows the Bank of Canada has been important in preserving provincial financial stability, including their decision last year to start buying provincial bonds to help stabilize interest rates at low levels. The reality is that a big increase in interest rates is going to cause financial distress and economic distress and unemployment all over the place, not just in provincial governments. In fact, it will cause big distress in the private sector before it starts really causing destruction in the public sector. This is the relative debt burdens of the major sectors in Canada's economy, and the total government sector, with gross debt of around 100% of GDP, is less indebted than households and less indebted than non-financial corporations. So long before seemingly self-destructive increase in interest rates hurt the public sector, it's going to hurt Canadian households and corporate plans and cause a recession. So that's why it's not a reasonable prospect to think that interest rates are going to suddenly shoot up. And then there's the additional factor that we have an inertial trend towards lower interest rates in Newfoundland because of the turnover of the outstanding debt. So this analysis suggests that the focus on cutting spending and cutting programs is misplaced. The true strategies for reaching a sustainable fiscal situation should involve focusing on boosting the rate of nominal GDP growth, constraining interest rates, although that is obviously not something Newfoundland has direct control over, and then within those bounds, targeting some kind of sustainable operating deficit, not a balanced budget. And the ways that you get to a sustainable operating budget is you do look at the tax side and you do look at the program spending side. But Newfoundland's existing operating deficit is completely sustainable. In fact, it's in surplus. How would you increase nominal growth? Well, we're hearing a range of ideas today, and we're already seeing obviously a rebound. The budget forecasts a 16% rebound in nominal GDP in Newfoundland this year, and that's going to have a huge impact on all of the variables that we're looking at. Other things to look at in the long run, migration we were just talking about in Kathy's presentation, really important, both internal migration within Canada. The whole work from home phenomena that we've seen during the pandemic would facilitate a lot of movement back to Newfoundland by people who want to come there, either for family reasons or because the housing is more affordable or the quality of life is high. International migration and getting a greater share of that for Newfoundland, another key variable. Human capital innovation is the main driver of economic growth around the advanced world now, and Newfoundland has to be a part of that and has the potential to be, and developing a broader portfolio of base industries, including sustainable resource industries, because we all know what's happening with fossil fuels, but also knowledge, technology, digital service industries that can also be export-oriented base industries. Public services themselves are a base industry. It's a way of initiating investment, production, and job creation, and then generating the same spin-offs from a big hospital or a big university that support private sector activity, same as if you were building a big factory or a big mine. Not one of these strategies for increasing nominal GDP growth will be helped, and all of them will be harmed by a program of fiscal austerity motivated by a misguided drive to try and balance a budget that doesn't have to be balanced. And there's lots of evidence from around the world, including, of course, what happened in Europe since the global financial crisis. Not learning from Europe in the sense that some people have said, well, we've got to cut all our programs or else we're going to turn into Greece. That's not the lesson we have from Europe. The lesson we have from Europe is that misplaced austerity will absolutely hammer economic performance and living conditions for years and years at a time. And the overwhelming consensus in the world is that the European austerity was a mistake. And the ability of unelected bureaucrats at the EU level to do that to large sections of the European economy has to be fixed. Luckily, we have more accountability in Canada than that, and I don't see why that would or should happen, but we still hear similar arguments. This shows you what a disaster austerity was in Europe. how badly Europe's economy performed in the decade after the GFC and the resulting cutbacks. And this hasn't solved the debt problem in Europe at all. In fact, the debt problem was not a problem in Europe, just like it's not a problem in America, where the economy has vastly outperformed the Europeans. So just to wrap up, from my perspective, I think the doom and gloom rhetoric that we've seen over the last couple of years is not appropriate. It's not required. Newfoundland's fiscal situation is not dire. By the most important measure of fiscal stability, that's the interest rate burden relative to GDP. There's hardly been any change in Newfoundland over the last year, over the last decade. And the key drivers of that stability, namely low and falling interest rates, and now a rebound in nominal GDP growth, are going to fuel continued stability on the fiscal side. Going at public programs to slash spending, whether it's on healthcare or the university or education or infrastructure, all of the things that could underpin stronger growth in Newfoundland's economy would be absolutely self-defeating. And the key factors are going to be interest rates and keeping them low. That's not a Newfoundland decision, but the people running the Bank of Canada are not stupid. And accelerating nominal GDP growth. That should be the focus of Newfoundland's economic policy discussions going forward, not balancing the budget, because the budget doesn't have to be balanced. So I will leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to any questions that we have. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we'll take some questions. We've got 10 minutes for that before we break for lunch. Any questions in the room or online? We've got one here. If you just remind you, just to introduce yourself at the beginning.
Hi, my name's Evan Piercy. So what you say generally makes sense. You know, there is a point where we can operate a operating deficit where, you know, it's sustainable. But there has been times in Newfoundland where the budget deficit has gone above 400 million. So just for a point of reference, if we were going to cut anything, what is something we should definitely not cut or try and impose austerity on? Like education, healthcare, what's the one that would definitely cause the most damage?
Well, that's quite a devil's choice you're posing. First of all,
we're in devil's choice mode in this province a little bit. So.
Yeah. Just to clarify, it's not the deficit of 400 million, it's an operating deficit of 400 million, and there have been years that's been bigger than that, but not many. Most years the operating deficit has been a surplus, actually. So just to, again, reinforce how much that vision of what's doable and what's stable is different than the idea that you have to balance your budget or all the time, or even balance your budget in peak years of the business cycle. Neither of those are true. What would I cut? You know, where I might take a look is to look at some of the tax expenditures. That's a part of the budget that often gets overlooked. There is a whole suite of tax incentives, tax loopholes, tax credits, other ways that governments in the past have tried to use the tax system to elicit different types of behavior. Some of them make sense, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them are kind of pork barreling or catering to particular interest groups. And I know the government in Newfoundland puts out a little review or a little kind of inventory of tax expenditures with each year's budget. And, you know, that might be one place to start looking for savings. You know, you're closing loopholes and stopping the loss of revenue as opposed to actually cutting programs. But I think for all intents and purposes, you should treat tax expenditures like a kind of spending, and that's one kind of spending that in many cases could be cut back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have another question in the room?
We just had one.
We've got one online.
Perfect.
Yep.
I just have one coming online there. It's from Ford Adams. Ford says, thanks for this refreshing representation. We don't often hear such an optimistic outlook in this province, especially in light of the recent Green Report. How can we best help governments, business, and individuals understand this point of view?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think government does understand this point of view. I don't think there's any rocket science in this presentation. I think that many of the debates that we've had about budgets and fiscal policy get shaped more by politics than by the mathematics or the economics. So, I do think that we should learn this ourselves, more as a way of insulating ourselves against some of the false hysteria that we've seen over the last couple of years. I'm reminded of the quote by the great economist Joan Robinson, the British Keynesian economist, who famously said, "The purpose of studying economics is not to learn about the economy, it's to learn how to protect yourself from economists." Okay, and in that regard, for us to learn about things like the debt stability equation, and it's not a nice thing to look at first thing in the morning, especially on Pacific time, but to learn about those things and understand how they work will insulate us against some of the predictable rhetoric about the need to balance the budget. And we're hearing that in the federal election as well, and showing governments and business leaders and the media that the public understands this and won't be sucked in by a chicken little kind of argument about the deficit, I think would help to shift the discourse. So educate ourselves and then show the politicians that we know what we're talking about.
Thank you. Do we have any more online questions?
Yeah, actually, we did get one more in.
Give them an equal chance today.
Yeah, thank you, Riley. This is from Bhavesh Sani. They're wondering, would the adoption of policies similar to developing countries instead of developed countries, such as focus on infrastructure and resources, be beneficial to Newfoundland and Labrador's long run, where GDP is an indicator of fiscal health rather than deficit to GDP ratio?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't think that focusing on resources and infrastructure are goals that are just limited to developing countries. I think they're very important in an industrial country context as well. And of course, focusing on resources these days has to mean focusing on sustainable resources. Newfoundland has learned that lesson more than once. And Newfoundland has a lot of sustainable resources that can be part of base industries that help to underpin a growth in GDP. Infrastructure itself, apart from contributing to productivity and efficiency, itself adds to GDP, economic activity, and employment. So absolutely a no-brainer. And I think your point that it is ultimately all about GDP growth as the determinant of fiscal health rather than balanced budget. I think that's entirely consistent with what I was trying to stress. The biggest focus of Newfoundland's economic policy debates should not be on how to get the deficit down. We'll be wasting our energy and we'll be wasting the attention and goodwill of Newfoundlanders if we do that. The biggest focus should be how do we put more people to work doing more good stuff, producing more goods and services. That's what will grow G in those equations, and that's what will ultimately be the key to maintaining fiscal policy in a stable setting.
Okay. We'll take one more question in the room.
I'm Herb Emery. Great presentation as always. You have a great way of putting the facts and figures out so that we can see a different perspective on things. One thing I wanted to ask you to clarify a bit, though, compared to the previous presentations this morning, is you're focused a lot on the historical record of revenues and expenditures to come up with stability. But the other piece that the province and the region is worrying about is the longer term liabilities of population aging and meeting future costs that they can see on the horizon. And some of that's coming with an expectation of increasing roles of the federal government, as we're seeing in the election with the Canada Health Transfer promises to increase. So can you just clarify, does that kind of perspective change how you see the situation, or is it all part of the same kind of hand-wringing that's going on, and that this really is just about getting back to growth and getting the good solutions with human capital and things along those lines? Just your comments on how we reconcile the future liability concerns with the historical record of things being okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, that's a very great question, very wise. Of course, the aging population and then the demands for healthcare and other services that go with the aging population are critical there. Now, I think we do have to look at that as an opportunity as well as a challenge. It is an opportunity in the sense that hiring people to produce the services that our elders want and need is a form of economic growth. And I refuse to look at healthcare costs as, just one ledger on the expense side of a budget. Healthcare is a booming, value-added, leading industry. It's not just a cost. And the jobs that are created in healthcare are good jobs. By and large, and the value that's added in healthcare is a boost to the economy. So there's an opportunity side there. And now, of course, there's the question of how do you pay for it, we can still take that question seriously, even if we reject the simplistic balanced budget rhetoric. There is going to be an impact on federal provincial transfers that comes from that. The other part of the opportunity is I think there may be a connection between inward migration back to Newfoundland and aging. Of course, Newfoundlanders ended up all over Canada, and many of them, I'm sure, want to come home. And as I mentioned, the work from home phenomena makes that in a way more feasible. And then a lot of people are going to want to come home when they retire. So that's another way this could be an opportunity, not just a challenge. If we look at it, I think in terms of the concrete reality of how are we going to build the services that these people need in Newfoundland, and how are we going to seek a fair way of sharing the costs of that through our federal system, then I think it's a challenge, no doubt about it, but a manageable one and one that has a good side to it as well.
Okay, we have just 3 minutes, so if it's a quick question. Introduce yourself first, please.
David Vardy, I have a question. GDP is a measure of welfare income used to compare across jurisdictions. You're using it in the case of Canada. Is GDP a good measure of welfare in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador when so many payments are made that are included in GDP that involve leakage of income to other provinces? And so is there a distortion there? Because clearly, when you take the raw data, comparing net debt or gross debt, whatever you want to take per capita for different provinces, Newfoundland stands out as an outlier, very high level of debt. Our debt is very high, our deficit is very high on a per capita basis. Now, what you're doing is you're adjusting it based on gross domestic product. And so, but GDP in Newfoundland is composed quite differently than GDP in Nova Scotia, because of the fact that we have such large infusion of resource investment in, particularly in the offshore. And so if you were at the national level, you would have probably chosen GPP as a better gross national product, rather. GPP data do not exist at the provincial level, as I understand it, in Canada. So I'm wondering, is there a distortion in the data you are presenting by virtue of the fact you're using GDP as opposed to a measure of incomes derived in the province? If you were to use, for example, disposable income, personal disposable income, would you get the same kind of conclusions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would never use GDP as a measure of welfare. First of all, it's absolutely not the case for all kinds of reasons. And in Newfoundland's situation, the difference between GDP and well-being is exacerbated by the fact that much of the increase in GDP that Newfoundland experienced from the petroleum industry never set foot in the province. Really, it was captured in the form of operating surpluses by those oil companies. So on the other hand, there's still a relevance, an economic relevance to the amount of gross output and revenue that's generated within a jurisdiction, and Newfoundland has capacity to tax that revenue. So I think it's relevant, but I think your points about being cautious about GDP are quite well taken.
And that's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Lunch is being served outside in the lobby. So we've only allowed a very short period of time for you to get your lunch and come back, and we'll have our next speaker while we refresh ourselves here. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.